Thank you for tuning in to this special episode of Movie Geeks United. Elaine May's Mikey and Nicky is an underrated classic of 1970s American cinema. Released in 1976, the film stars Peter Falk and John Cassavetes as the title characters, two lifelong friends and small-time mobsters operating in Philadelphia. Cassavetes' Nicky has stolen money from his boss and has a hit put out on him. So he calls up his best friend, Peter Falk's Mikey, to help him out of his predicament. Little does he know that Mikey has been tasked with delivering his friend to mob justice. This stunning movie is completely devoid of romanticism, coming from the penetrating gaze of Elaine May, the legendary actress, writer, and director who's primarily associated with her work in the comedy world. The film explores depths that are entirely unique to the crime genre. The long gestating frictions between two friends who share far too much history, the nature of toxic masculinity, and the wounds that hide behind the suspicious glances and tough guy chatter. Patrick Cooper has written a new book about the film titled Aren't You Gonna Die Someday? Elaine May's Mikey and Nicky, an examination, reflection, and making of. We highly recommend the book, and it can be purchased wherever books are sold. Tell me where this obsession with the movie started for you.
It started when I first saw the film, I was in college, so this was maybe about 2003, and I was just sort of going through a deep dive into 70s crime cinema, everything from the big names like The Godfather all the way down to, Busting with Elliot Gould, things like that. And the films about gangsters, sort of the gang bosses, the crime lords, never really interested me. I was always attracted to the low men on the totem pole, if you will. I like to call them the gangsters that actually work for a living. So I came across Mikey and Nicky, and I honestly didn't think too much of it at first. I mean, I love Falk and Cassavetes. I wasn't really familiar with Elaine May's other work at the time, but something about the film really just, it was almost like a song. I couldn't get it out of my head, the dialogue, the beats. It was almost like a melody that was just stuck in my head over the years. So I just continued to watch it, and each time something would be revealed to me about the characters and the lies that they tell each other and that they tell themselves. And eventually, just as a way to sort of get it out of my head, I started writing this book and eventually got it published. So.
Did the process of writing it, what did it crystallize for you in terms of why am I so attracted to this film? Like, did you understand why, the reasons why a lot better when you reached the end of the book?
Yeah, absolutely. It started as just an exploration of, well, why can't I get this film out of my head? And very early on, it became apparent to me is I feel a very personal connection to this film. And the reason for that being, I feel like I see myself in both Mikey and Nicky, in the Falk and Cassavetes characters. I see friendships that I had over the years. In the book, I focus on one friendship in particular. I don't say the person's name, but there's a lot of parallels between Mikey and Nicky's relationship and this relationship I had growing up into adulthood, until it eventually broke off, not in such a violent manner as the friendship ends in the film, but and we weren't criminals or anything, but just the manipulation and the sort of leeching off one another and resentment and everything. It was all very personal for me as I was writing this book. And just, it's a pretty fascinating behind the scenes story. And there were so many big personalities involved and behind the scenes clashes between Paramount and May. That aspect was very fun to write, but it was to be honest, it was a very dark place to be. The year I spent writing this book, it was a very dark world to live in, because of the content of the film itself, and then the sort of the shadows it drug up in my own personal life, looking back on this friendship I had.
Yeah, that friendship is, I mean, it's everything to the movie.
Yeah.
How would you describe the dynamic between them? Because on one hand, they have such an enormous history together, from the time they were children, and yet they clearly are kind of toxic for one another.
Right, and I think we've all had friendships like that. Maybe not to that degree, but I think the dynamic is one of depending on one another, but also there's just this unspoken jealousy between them. I think in a way Nicky is jealous of Mikey's sort of calm domestic life. He has what seems like a happy marriage. He has a child, a son that wants to see him when he comes home, versus Nicky's, disruptive sort of personal life he has with his wife Jan, and he's not allowed. He barely knows his newborn daughter. But so I think it's one where they resent one another. They depend on one another. Mikey wants Nicky to love him. Nicky, he just wants everyone to love him. And if he has to throw Mikey under the bus or make fun of him in front of other people and talk about him behind his back, that's the type of guy he is. That's what he'll do to make people laugh. So they like being around him. But then when he's alone with Mikey, it's all, kissing each other's asses. But, under that surface there's just decades of resentment.
Yeah. It's interesting that the tagline of that movie that the studio went with, what was it? You won't like them?
But yeah, that was the original tagline. I believe it was by the end. It was something like, by the end of the film, you won't like them. Something like that. Yeah.
Wow. Come see our movie.
Yeah. You're gonna have an awful time, and you'll hate the characters.
Yeah. What was the thinking behind that?
I don't know. I'm sure by that point Paramount just put a few ads out there, and they put it out Christmas 1976. What a perfect Christmas movie. I think they just wanted to be done with it at that point, and done with May. Wow.
Well, let's get into the difficulty, but I guess let's start with how it started for her, because this seems on the outset like a really uncharacteristic film for her, because she comes from the world of comedy, and a lot of her comedies have great bite to them. But this was on like a different plane. Where did this story occur to her?
Well, there's a few different versions of the story, of the origins of the film. There's a great book about the history of the improv troupe that Elaine May was in Chicago called the Compass Players. That's where she met Mike Nichols. But according to one of her colleagues in that improv troupe, she had first drafted this script all the way back in 1954 when I believe she was 22 years old. So it came from a very personal place for her. And Julian Schlossberg, who would later go on to re-release the film, says that it came from a place of her family. She knew people like this. She had told Peter Falk that it was something that did happen to her relatives. And also her cousin, I believe it was her cousin, was her assistant on the film. And her cousin had told a Paramount publicist that it was something that she drew from a story that her uncle had told her when he owned a bar in the 40s, and something happened to two individuals at the bar. So she drew it from that. And you're right, it is a very uncharacteristic film for her. But also on another level, it's also sort of fits in with the themes of her other films, which is betrayal. There's always a pair in one of her films, from A New Leaf, which is Walter Matthau and herself. There's a betrayal there. Same in The Heartbreak Kid, although she didn't write that one. And then also in Ishtar, it's two best friends that go on to sort of betray each other in a way as well. So while it is uncharacteristic, I think that theme is still there, which is betrayal.
Did she have, when she was growing up, did she have any kind of exposure to these lower level mob guys herself?
That's what I heard. That's what Julian Schlossberg had said, was that her family was involved in the mafia to some degree, sort of on the outskirts of it in a way. I don't know any particulars, and she doesn't talk to anybody. She doesn't give interviews. I really tried to. So I'm sure we'll never know exactly. But as far as from what I can tell, it was people that she knew that sort of inspired this story.
Mm. So if she had been working on the script for that long, Were there prior kind of lives that this movie took before it finally got off the ground? I mean, did she have previous casting ideas in mind, or did she try to mount it before she got it off the ground?
I know it had started, when she had started writing it, it was a one-act play, and then it evolved over time, and I believe that before she signed a contract with Paramount to do it, it was supposed to be made by another company, even before A New Leaf, I believe, but then that fell through, and then she wound up doing A New Leaf. And her first two films, A New Leaf and Heartbreak Kid, were both critical successes, and so by that point, Paramount was just pretty much gave her a slate to do whatever she wanted, so she went to Mikey and Nicky.
And it almost feels like it's unimaginable without Cassavetes and Falk, because they had obviously already engaged in this working relationship / close friendship, and so you really feel the life between the lines in the movie.
Yeah, it's there.
Yeah.
It's there. And if I could backtrack for a second, actually, I know that Charles Grodin was initially going to be Nicky.
Okay.
He even read with Falk, and Falk said that he was scary. He came off as too scary, if you could imagine Charles Grodin as that. But eventually, it came down to Cassavetes and Falk. And you're absolutely right. That history is there. And I talk about it in my book. They don't even need to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And you just, there's just, the air is so thick between them, not just with tension, because, in context, Mikey's setting Nicky up to be killed, but just that you just feel that history. And that scene in the bar, for instance, when they're just killing time and Mikey's waiting for the phone to ring. And I think there's almost a minute that goes by of them not talking to each other. Nicky's just sitting there smoking at Mikey, and just the facial expressions, everything is just, it's so palpable. It's incredibly strong. They're just like the absolute best of saying so much without speaking.
Did Falk and Cassavetes, did they talk about the experience of working with Elaine May and what she did to kind of take advantage of their camaraderie?
Yeah, May really let them just go off. She gave them a lot of freedom. From what I heard, she was the type of director that she wanted people to stay to the script. That's something I think that surprises a lot of people about this film. That there wasn't everything you hear on the film is in the script pretty much. I'd say 90% of it. So while I think she did let them experiment a lot, there was also just sticking to the script. Cassavetes was notorious for going off script to try to see what reaction he would get from his co-stars. And May didn't like that. She would make him stick with the lines. But she would continuously roll. She rarely called cut. There's stories about on this film where the film actually ran out in the camera and she would not call cut because something so powerful was going on. And then eventually the cameraman would say, hey, we're not even getting this. So there was a lot of freedom. She let the actors move wherever they wanted to, which was hell for the focus people behind the camera. There is a story where she bit, I don't know if you read this one, but she bit Peter Falk on the lip in order to enrage him before his fight with Cassavetes in the street. They had stopped filming, I think. They had stopped filming overnight, and Falk just couldn't get back in that mind space. He couldn't get that anger up again in him. So Elaine called cut and called him over and drew him in real close, like she was going to whisper to him, and then bit him on the ear, or bit him on the lip and pushed him out there and called action. And so I think she had little ways to get actors going, but for the most part, I think there was a lot of freedom as long as they said the lines.
Yeah, there's Cassavetes has this kind of antsy, wounded vulnerability. I mean, he almost looks like a scared little kid a lot of times, and then Falk has this great power and intensity. And this is prime Columbo Falk. I mean, he's the beloved guy on everyone's TV set, and he's playing this very volatile character. He's terrific.
Yeah. No, absolutely, I agree. Cassavetes, I mean, he looks sick through the whole movie. He looks like he's ill. And Falk is just so commanding, especially in those early scenes. And then he starts to come off the rails a little bit, and you just see him sort of for the pathetic character that he is. He just wants people to love him. His wife doesn't really pay attention to him. His father didn't love him. And his best friend treats him like trash. And so he goes from, oh, this is the guy to call when you need someone to depend on, to, oh, this guy's a sucker. This is why you call him, because he's the guy that's going to answer.
Yeah, it's fascinating that the movie, well, first of all, that, we've seen a lot of glamorized mob movies, some of which are terrific, but this is like the working stiffs in the organization, but it's also unique because these guys are seen through a female gaze, which is really unique for this genre of film. And I'm wondering, she doesn't seem to pass judgment on them. But she seems to be very clear about who they are and what their faults are. And I'm wondering from you what you think that female gaze is that she brings to this.
Yeah, absolutely. And she definitely doesn't sugarcoat the way they treat women. I mean, all the women in the film are treated very poorly.
Yeah.
To a physically abusive and a sexually abusive level. There's some scenes in this, particularly between Nicky and his mistress Nellie, played by Carol Grace, that are just incredibly uncomfortable to watch, to the point where I used to fast forward those scenes. So I think what May brought to it was a lot of honesty and a lot of she I don't think she had to go out of her way to do it, because these are the type of characters they are. So she just held a mirror up to sort of these men that are in a very masculine, physical world. And I mean masculine here in a very negative manner. They treat each other horribly and step on each other's throats, and they treat their women horribly. So I think she brought a lot of honesty to that. And you really learn a lot about the characters of Mike and Nicky by the way they treat their women and the interactions they have, and from, Nicky picking up the woman in the bar, or trying to pick up the woman in the bar, to him throwing his wife on the couch and slapping his mistress. You don't like them by the end of the film, as the tagline says.
There you go. I guess that's where the tagline comes from. Yeah, but at the same time, I think maybe people might have been turned off that she doesn't seem to impose her own kind of giving a sermon to these characters. She's just observing them and all of their flaws, and not commenting, not putting a kind of an aside. Look how awful these people are. Right.
And they're not, Nicky's not killed because he's horrible to women. You're right. There is no judgment there. This is how they treat women, and he's going to die anyway because of Mikey setting him up and the way he crossed his boss, Resnick. You're right. There is no judgment there. And I think maybe that can put definitely a sour taste in some people's mouths.
But that's indicative of a lot of the great 70s cinema we love too. I mean, there's this kind of devotion to showing things as they are, without any kind of editorial commentary on it,
Right. Yeah. And that carries off the screen in the way you feel about these films,
Yeah.
I don't like writing about the scenes where Nicky's abusive to Nellie,
But the movie feels so a part of the Cassavetes canon. And obviously when Elaine came up with this idea, it was before Cassavetes really took hold and created his own brand of filmmaking. But it really feels like an extension of that brand, Mikey and Nicky.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's often confused for a Cassavetes film. I've seen that online before. People call it a Cassavetes film. There is that element of just that macho-ness to it, and these women caught in the crosshairs, left at home, and sort of that. There's a feeling that it is improv, but it's not.
Yeah, which is amazing. That's an amazing fact.
I was so shocked. I got. It took me a little while to get a copy of the script, but I eventually got one from the producer, Mike Hausman. He made a copy of his script, which is dated 1972, and it's all there.
Wow.
I mean, almost word for word some of the scenes. Yeah, there's some deleted scenes, but for the most part, yeah, it's there. It's all on the page.
Yeah, it's amazing, and because they feel like totally spontaneous performances. Like actors talk about being in the moment. These two performances are really in the moment, and and so you would think that it would be improvised, but I mean they're just time vault performances. Why did the movie have? The movie had a couple of DPs, right?
It had, I think, 6 altogether.
Why is that?
People just couldn't. Well, I know the big one was Victor Kemper, who had actually worked with Cassavetes on Husbands.
Yeah.
Just a few years or a year prior, I think, before they started shooting Mikey and Nicky. But it was just constant clashing with May. From what I've heard, Victor quit, and then they had another DP. I forget his name. He had an eye patch, though. I know that he would wear an eye patch behind the camera. He was the one who tried to tell her that the camera was out of film, and May just wouldn't let him stop pretending to be shooting. And then eventually Paramount sort of tried to rush things along, so they forced May to shoot the remainder in Los Angeles. They moved her from Philadelphia to Los Angeles, but she still had stuff to do in Philly, so they sent the crew out there, and Cassavetes shot some of the film. And then the producer, Mike Hausman, shot the scene where Nicky, all the shots from inside the car where the hitman Kinney is circling Mikey's house before dawn. Mike Hausman shot all that stuff. At that point, it was just a matter of let's just finish the goddamn movie and do what we have to do before Paramount tears it from May's hands.
But you would think that it would look like a mess with all of those different heads in there, but it doesn't. It's very seamless. And that's interesting how she would let a take go on, almost like she was letting them work it out. It almost feels like like psychoanalysis, psychotherapy or something.
Yeah, and she did have a psychology background, and she wound up marrying her therapist. So I think there was a lot to that. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And from what I've heard, there was a lot of letting Falk and Cassavetes get to those moments that you see on the film. There would be a lot of just not rehearsals so much as discussion before they would go to the set, sitting in May's trailer, just the 3 of them, and just discussing the scene and discussing the motivation behind the characters for that scene. Probably, I would assume, discussing the history behind the scene and the history behind what they were going to discuss. And so from what I've heard, there was a lot of that, a lot of the crew waiting around, getting ready to work, just standing there. Talking to Mike Hausman, the producer, who has had an incredible career with Milos Forman, amongst other people. When he talks about this film, he talks about just so much waiting and so much just trying to do his job and sort of just constantly being stopped by May, who just wanted to talk about the film and get things right. Yeah,
that's incredible. I mean, just that level of just care about what you're doing, you know.
And like we said, she started writing this in her 20s, and almost 30 years, I think, went by where this movie was in her head. So not only did she know what she wanted, it meant a lot.
Yeah. But she didn't, what was it, Paramount that released it, you said?
Yeah, it was Paramount.
So they weren't kind of enchanted by her indulgences?
It got to a point where not so much. I'm surprised they worked with her, because they also released A New Leaf, her first film, which was also, I think it was 10 months of editing, and she eventually turned in, I think, a 3-hour cut of the film. So I don't know why they were so keen to work with her again. Probably because Heartbreak Kid was a success and had an Academy Award nomination. So with Mikey and Nicky, yeah, I think they were excited to work with May again, but then the shoot was supposed to finish summer of 73, I believe it was, and it went from May 73 to March 74. So almost a year. There was a break so Falk could shoot a season of Columbo during the summer. And then you're talking almost 2 years of editing, 1.5 million feet of film for a 90-minute little crime movie.
Wow.
So that there was lawsuits involved. Because May did have final cut of the film. That was in the contract. And the contract was 33 pages long. Paramount really tried to cover all of their bases to make sure that they could actually get this movie made in a timely manner. But they did give May final cut, so there wasn't much they could do. So there was lawsuits involved. In 1975, they sued. Then she countersued. Peter Falk and her created a sort of a shell company that May went ahead and sold the U.S. distribution rights behind Paramount's back to this shell company. So Paramount had to sue to get that back. And then there's the infamous case of the missing reels of film. I don't know. I've heard a few different versions, so I'm not sure how truthful it is. But apparently May had her husband at the time. I believe it was her husband. It might have just been her boyfriend at the time, but I'm not sure. But her partner at the time, she had him go and hide the reels of film in his garage in Connecticut. And there was some, well, I guess what you could call blackmail involved. She was basically blackmailing Paramount for more money to finish her editing on the film. So they reached an agreement. Warren Beatty even got involved at one point. He was friends with both May and Barry Diller, who was the head of Paramount, and he tried to sort of mediate the arrangement to get the film made, to get the film completed. I'm sorry. And so there was a very tumultuous post-production process on this film.
That's a lot of drama. That must have been great for you, though, in the process of research, knowing you're having to fill up an entire book, that you have all of this drama.
Yeah. And I do come from I was a history major in college, so I enjoy research and I enjoy putting puzzles together. Yeah. So this was all of that, having to talk to a few different people to try to figure out the actual facts of the editing process. It turns out, and I think this is the way it was, it wasn't a matter of Elaine May being this sort of crazy perfectionist in the editing room. There was 1.5 million feet of film, so there was a lot of work involved. But it was also, May has said this herself, that it was all because of the audio track. That's why it took 2 years to edit this film, is because there was 2 audio tracks. I'm not very good with technical side of film, but there was 2 audio tracks, and getting them to match the actual, lips of Falk and Cassavetes was incredibly time consuming. So actually getting it where it looked like the movie made sense, like the dialogue matched the film, is apparently what took 2 years to complete.
Wow. How was it received? Yeah. How was it received generally when it came out?
There were a handful of people who praised the film right off the bat. It was called a masterpiece, I think, in the New Yorker. But of course, a lot of people were expecting an Elaine May comedy, right. a cut up from the woman from Nichols and May, and she was worried about that, I've heard. Falk was also worried about it. He gave an interview before the release of the film, sort of sweating how people were going to want to go into the theater and see a comedy and go see this very dark, very honest film that came from a very personal place. Yeah. It was for the most part, it was not received well. It was called Rambling. It was called A Celluloid Death Wish. 90 minutes of Falk and Cassavetes acting at you, almost as if they're acting with some kind of violent aggression toward the audience. So no, it was not received well.
Wow. How much of that do you think was the notion that Elaine May is kind of wading in male waters. Like she's making a movie that's very much about masculinity.
Yeah. That's a good point. I think there definitely could have been some of that. There could have been some pushback because how dare this female comedian try to make a gangster film?
Mm.
Yeah.
It's so shocking now, though. I mean, this movie, I know it's grown in popularity, and you've written a book about it, and obviously Criterion releasing it on their platforms is doing
thank God.
So it's coming back to the fore, but as much as we romanticize 70s cinema, it seems odd that Mikey and Nicky is often ignored in that conversation.
Yeah, and I'm a great consumer of 70s cinema, especially 70s crime films. I love them dearly. But even Mikey and Nicky with on the shelf with all those 70s crime films just feels different. Like, it might just be my personal feelings toward the film, but it just feels different. It just feels dirtier than any other crime film. It feels more honest. And I mean, we're talking about a crime film where there's no crime in it, basically.
That's right.
Up until the very end, where I hope people listening have watched the movie, but up until the very end, when Nicky is killed, there's no crime in this film. It's a lot of sitting around talking and exposing, their feelings to each other. In double speak, and it's a crime film with no crime. Basically.
It's even though it doesn't have that criminal element, it really, it's still very violent. I mean, in terms of behavior,
Yeah. And a lot of that violence in the film is against civilians. Mm-hmm. You have Mikey attacking the clerk at the little cafe. You have Nicky attacking the bus driver, and making fun of the woman on the bus. And
the two of them constantly at each other's throats, and it's very aggressive movie.
Yeah, it is. And their fight in the street is so.
Yes.
You talk about the honesty of the film. Their fight in the street, you could tell it's been boiling up for decades, and it's such a sloppy fight. There's no clean punches. Nicky just slips on the cement. It's such a wonderful fight scene.
I don't know how many interviews she's done over the years. Very few, I know. But has Elaine May given any indication of how that movie ranks with her? If she was very pleased with how it actually came out?
There's nothing. And you're right. I think she's done 2 interviews in the past 60 years. But as far as I know, I don't know. I don't know how it ranks with her. I think it was something that. I think it's a film that she had to make, that it was extremely personal, and she needed to get it out. Mm-hmm. But I don't know. I don't think she's one of those filmmakers and one of those artists that just does not like talking about her work.
Yeah, she's very elusive. You actually live near Philly, right?
Yeah, I'm out in the suburbs, about 15 or so miles north of Philly.
Have you ever tried to scout some of the Mikey and Nicky locations?
I did. I went to the location where you first see Mikey on the film. It is at 13th and Filbert Street, very close to City Hall. That's actually where, if you look in the book, that's where the author photo was taken. I thought that would be appropriate. But it looks very similar. All the lights hanging in that walkway are all the same. So it was very cool to be back there where you first see Mikey on film when Nicky throws the bottle wrapped up in the pillowcase out the window at him.
Yeah.
But the hotel's gone. I think it's a business, sort of an office building now. The hotel where we first meet Nicky is gone. The bar, the African-American bar, is gone. The bar where they hang out and Mikey is waiting for the phone call from Kinney, and there's the guys playing pinball, that's still there. It's like an Irish sports bar type of place now. But yeah, it is a very interesting snapshot of Philadelphia in the early 70s.
It is, yeah. and unique that it happens in a place like Philly when you're used to these happening in, New York City and these kinds of stories.
Yeah, and I think that adds a lot too, as far as without making it clear exposition, but just making it a gangster film in Philadelphia where you don't usually see these type of films, and it's not, these aren't New York gangsters, these aren't these aren't even North Jersey gangsters, they're Philly gangsters, it's sort of like a way station in between the South and New York.
Right.
Things aren't popping off as much as they are in New York, they're running numbers.
Right. Yeah, I love visiting movie locations. I almost, because whenever I visit LA, I always make it a point to visit as many locations as I can, and it feels like the places that are still there, it feels almost like hallowed ground. Like you try to imagine Falk and Cassavetes were walking these streets this many years ago. Oh, such a romanticism about that.
Yeah. And while it wasn't a location, I had the pleasure of visiting the producer, Mike Hausman, at his apartment in New York City, and it was just such a time capsule of all the films he's been on, all the work he's done over the years. He has an amazing collection of photos. So yeah, that made me very excited to work on the book. Just visiting and getting able to speak with him. He was very generous.